who we are. We were the Louisiana Budget Project. I was the guy who covered the budget for the Times-Picayune for years. And, one of the things that always bothered me when I was at the Capitol was that it felt like the people who need state government to work for them the most, which is, the people with low and moderate incomes, often had the least amount of power in those rooms, and the people who needed state government the least were the ones who had all of the power. And so I always wished there was somebody there to kind of speak for the people with low and moderate incomes. And when we talk about that in Louisiana, we're really talking about half the population, the folks who are living below the poverty line and those who are just above the poverty line, but really kind of struggling to get by week to week, month to month, and they might be, one financial emergency away. And so that's what we try to look out for with state policies. And at Invest, we really believe, and the name kind of implies, that our economy in Louisiana and anywhere is going to work best when everybody in the state has the tools that they need to thrive. And that means access to great schools, safe communities, affordable and accessible health care, good transportation, so that everybody has an equal access to the benefits of our economy. And we think that those are the things that frankly, that companies and investors look for when they decide where they want to invest, build companies, create jobs. And I think back, I'm going to talk a little bit about the special session, but we just had a big special session on taxes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But one of the reasons that we were given for the need for this special session is we need to be a little bit more like North Carolina. North Carolina is gaining population. People are moving in, and in Louisiana, people are moving out. And we were told that's because of tax policy and because North Carolina was cutting taxes, and that's why people are moving in. When you really look at what happened in North Carolina, the growth trajectory they've been on started a lot earlier than 7, 8, 9 years ago when the elected officials in that state started cutting taxes. And in fact, by many respects, North Carolina was growing faster before the tax cut started. And it's because North Carolina made the decision generations ago to fundamentally transform their economy from one that was tobacco and textiles and farming to one that was centered on high tech, aerospace, banking, and those kind of industries. And they did it by building one of the best public university systems in the entire country, and having the research triangle, and having a really strong community and technical college system in that state, so that they really developed a kind of human infrastructure that made it such a magnet for people. So I think when I look at North Carolina, I do see them as an example for Louisiana to emulate, but maybe for different reasons than some others wanted us to look at North Carolina. So let's talk about where we were. I think the governor called a special session on taxes in November. It lasted for 20 days, and it really was a very consequential session for Louisiana, and made some changes that we're going to be living with for generations in Louisiana. For those of you who weren't paying enormous amounts of attention in November, it's not a time when most Louisianans are used to paying attention to politics. We passed the legislature and the governor signed a large cut in the personal income tax. We're going to a flat tax with a larger standard deduction. They passed a cut to the corporate income tax. They eliminated the corporate franchise tax. And to pay for some, but not all of these tax cuts, they raised and expanded the state sales tax. So the bottom line here is, and just keep in mind, going into this special session, Louisiana had a tax base where, when you measure, how much we spend on taxes, how much we tax our population compared to the size of the economy, we were really a fairly low tax state. Not the absolute lowest, but a fairly low tax state. But we had, when you look at overall sales taxes, we already were among the highest in the entire country on sales tax. Our personal income taxes and our corporate taxes were relatively low compared to most states. As a result of the special session, we went higher on the taxes where we were already high, and we went lower on the taxes where we were already low. And we were told that, you know, this was going to make Louisiana more competitive. We'll find out if that's the case. This just happened. The changes have been in effect for, you know, a month and 3 days. So we will find out about that. And that it was also necessary to address the so-called fiscal cliff. If you remember, we had a fiscal cliff that was facing us this year, and that fiscal cliff was a result of actions taken by previous legislators to pass a temporary state sales tax that was due to expire on June 30th. And so if that sales tax wasn't renewed, there was going to be a big fiscal cliff. Well, the good news is that the fiscal cliff isn't happening in 2025. The bad news is that the fiscal cliff was not solved by tax reform. The fiscal cliff was merely postponed by a couple of years. Yeah, just a few minutes ago before coming here, I looked up at and don't take my word for it, the Joint Legislative Committee on the Budget did this. So the governor has to produce a budget in a couple of weeks, and when he builds that budget, he needs to solve a budget shortfall of about $194 million. Sounds like a lot, but by historical standards, that's not enormous. Next year, that budget shortfall gets a little smaller, but 2 years from now, it's going to be back up to $571 million. The year after that, almost $700 million. And the way that they structured the income tax changes, we are actually going to be looking at bigger, if no changes are made, we're actually going to be looking at bigger and bigger shortfalls in the budget, because every single year, the way they structured the income tax changes, the standard exemption is going to rise by inflation every year. So every time prices go up, there's going to be a little bit less revenue coming in from the income tax. So it's going to be harder and harder to balance the budget every year. So, and the reason that the fiscal cliff was postponed was because one of the things that they did to balance the budget at the last minute was simply redirect some money to the general fund that was supposed to be going into the vehicle, into the transportation trust fund. So a few years ago, the legislature decided that the money we pay in vehicle sales taxes was going to go into the transportation trust fund and pay for some major transportation projects, including the long overdue bridge in Lake Charles, the bridge, the new bridge in Baton Rouge, the Finnish I-49, some of these major projects we've been talking about in the state for decades. And instead of, and so what the legislature decided to do so that they wouldn't face a fiscal cliff is they're going to take some of that money from the Transportation Trust Fund and put it back in the general fund, but only for 2 years. So 2 years from now, the unless something else changes, the legislature is going to have a tough decision to make. Do we want to keep the money in the fund and start making down payments on these long overdue transportation projects, or do we want to put that money in the general fund and make it a little easier to balance the budget? So that's what the legislature did in November. The higher sales tax and the lower income taxes took effect on January 1st. Maybe you noticed it in your paycheck, maybe you didn't, but we have a 3% flat income tax right now. The next step in this is the constitutional amendment. And the other big thing that they did was pass a constitutional amendment. If you remember back in the spring, the governor wanted to have a constitutional convention in Louisiana, the first constitutional convention since 1972. There was a bill that got through the House to that effect, but the Senate said no, and the Senate wisely said no, because the governor's plan, frankly, was to rewrite the Louisiana Constitution in a 2-week session at the end of May with delegates that was handpicked by him that wouldn't have been elected. So Cameron Henry, I think, very wisely thought that was a bad idea. So Constitutional Convention didn't happen, but in November, during the special session, the legislature rewrote the largest part of the state constitution, Article 7, which governs taxes and budgets. And so on March 29th, there are going to be 4 amendments on the statewide ballot. Amendment 2 on March 29th is, and you can go read the bill for yourself, it's House Bill 7 from the 3rd special session. It's 115 pages long. And it is really a rewrite of the longest section of the state constitution. And I'm not being facetious when I say I defy you to find 5 people in the state of Louisiana who can comprehensively explain everything that you are going to be voting on March 29th. And this constitutional amendment, I was told I had 20 minutes, and there's no way I can go through this in 20 minutes. But I'm going to talk about a couple of things in there that you're going to probably be hearing about in the next few weeks. One is we're told that it's going to be provided permanent teacher pay raise, which is true, but to an extent. The way this teacher pay raise is being funded is the constitutional amendment would dissolve 2 constitutionally protected trust funds. That money would be spent to pay down debt in the teachers' retirement system. And if that debt is paid down, obviously the cost for retirement costs would go down, and school districts would be directed by a separate law to provide teachers with a $2,000 pay raise and a $1,000 pay raise for school support workers. That's great news if you're a teacher. Unfortunately, this pay raise is going to replace money that teachers have been getting for the last 2 years in the form of a stipend. The last 2 years, the legislature didn't want to give Louisiana's public school teachers a permanent pay raise, so they gave them a stipend instead. So what is really happening in this constitutional amendment is a stipend is being replaced by a pay raise, but if you're a teacher, you're getting the same exact amount of money next year as you're getting this year, unless the legislature decides somehow to add more money onto that. So that's the pay raise portion. But there's a cost to this because, again, the way that they're funding this is by dissolving 2 constitutionally protected funds, the Education Quality Support Fund and the Education Excellence Fund. Those funds combined have about $2 billion in them, and the legislature every year appropriates money for specific educational programs. About $68 million in recurring money comes out of those funds and supports everything from early childhood education to endowed chairs and professorships at universities, research programs. And there's a long list, and I have a spreadsheet on my laptop if anybody wants to talk to me after. But so one of the things that the legislature will have to do if they want to continue these programs, if this amendment passes, is find $68 million to fund these ongoing education programs. And they don't not just need to find it next year, but they need to find it the year after that, and the year after that, and the year after that. The constitutional amendment also includes what the supporters are calling a government growth limit. If you pay attention to state budget politics, you know that we've had an expenditure limit in the state constitution going back to the 1990s. This government growth limit that would replace the spending limit is orders of magnitude different because it basically says that it would put an artificial constraint on the ability of future legislators to appropriate money for new programs. What that means in practical terms is even if Louisiana were to somehow find itself with more revenue than they expected, if that revenue exceeds the government growth limit, it could not, under any circumstances, be plugged into additional programs. It could only be spent on one-time items. Why is that important? It's important because there are a lot of programs that I think people and a majority of voters really support and think we should be spending more money on an ongoing basis. Early childhood education, for one, is something, you know, the state's own studies show that we need $1 billion. a year to just take care of all the need there is in early childhood education, nobody's going to spend $1 billion, but even if they wanted to spend another 10 million, 20, $50 million of new recurring money to help young children from low-income families have access to early childhood education, they could be barred from doing that by the government growth limit. It would create a constitutional cap on the personal income tax that would be in the Constitution. We already have a cap of 4.75%. This would lower that to 3.75%. Again, this makes it harder for future legislators, if they should decide that Louisiana should rely more on personal income taxes and less on sales taxes, would make it harder for those decisions to be made. And it takes a lot of money that the state has put away in state savings accounts. Right now we have two rainy day trust funds in Louisiana. That money is there. One of those is to kind of help fund the budget during tough economic times. A second rainy day fund is set up to really deal with transportation funding, and a lot of the excess corporate revenue went into those. Those two trust funds would be combined into a single fund, and about $1 billion of that would be used as incentives for parishes to get rid of their inventory tax. And probably a little more complex than we want to talk about right now, but the bottom line is, if this constitutional amendment passes, Louisiana is going to have less money available in its savings accounts for a day when the economy goes south. So that's the constitutional amendment, and frankly, it's coming on March 29th in the height of festival season. I think we can all expect that turnout is going to be pretty low that day. There are no other major elections on the ballot. Again, it's not a time when people are used to voting, and no matter what you think of the wording, there is no way to adequately explain a 115-page bill in the ballot language that people will face. So there's really a lot of public education I think needs to happen between now and then. And so that brings me to kind of where we're heading next. And we're really getting into a pivotal point for the state budget. Again, if you've been around Louisiana, I've been around long enough. I've been here through boom times, and I've been here through bust times. And I remember when I took this job in 2011 was one of those bust times. Louisiana was coming. It was the Great Recession. We had just passed big tax cuts under Governor Bobby Jindal, and we had 5 or 6 years there when every year was a budget crisis, and higher education got cut. Teachers fell behind their southern and national peers in salary. We neglected a lot of infrastructure needs. We sold off state buildings and anything that wasn't completely nailed down to pay the bills. For the last 8 years, we've had more or less budget stability in state government. We have a generation of legislators now, except for maybe Francis Thompson, who's never leaving. But most state legislators who are there now, thanks to term limits, have not been through a time of a budget crisis. The state has to balance its budget every year, and so we're maybe not this year, but very soon heading into a really austere time for state government that is going to challenge the state's ability to provide basic services, to provide the services and programs we're funding now, let alone make new investments in the programs and policies that people need. And the reason that, and there's kind of two things that are putting pressure on the state budget, and part of that is the decisions that Governor Jeff Landry and the legislature have made during his first year in office, and the second part is the decisions that President Donald Trump and House Speaker Mike Johnson and others are projected to make during this new administration. So let's start with the state. We've been told, and the revenue estimate indicates that we're probably going to be looking at a standstill budget this year. But standstill does not account for some of the new spending that has been put into the pipeline by this governor. Specifically, very soon the state is going to need to spend more money on prisons and law enforcement because the first thing that happened when Jeff Landry took office, if you'll recall, was a special session on crime when the reforms that happened in a bipartisan manner in 2017 were reversed. So we are going to keep more people locked up for longer periods of time for a broader array of crime than ever before. Am I running low on time? Anyway, so regardless of what you think about who should be in jail and for how long, it is unquestionable that it is going to cost more money in the long run, and the costs are going to continue to multiply the longer we get into these new sentencing eras, because fewer people are going to be released on parole and probation, and when you lock somebody up, it costs money. The second thing is the school voucher plan that passed last year, which essentially is going to be making private school tuition subsidies available to people who are already making the decision to pay for private school regardless of income. So we're not talking about taking a kid who's in public school from a low-income family and taking that money and sending that child to a private school. This is taking new money to underwrite private school tuition for parents who have the means and who have already made that decision. So this is going to be a new cost to the state. So if you add those two costs, again, and everything else stays the same, it's going to be harder for the state to finance and balance its budget. And this is coming at a time when, and look, I don't want to get ahead of what's happening in Washington, and I think if you're like me, your head is kind of spinning for the last 2 weeks. But one thing I think we know for sure is that there is going to be on target on the backs of entitlement programs, especially those that help low and moderate income families. President Trump has promised that he doesn't want to touch Social Security and Medicare, but he hasn't made those promises with respect to Medicaid, and you've already heard that he wants to get rid of FEMA and block grant that money to the states. The result of that, in Louisiana, I should remind everybody, is almost uniquely dependent on federal dollars. There is no state that gets more and a higher percentage of its budget from the federal government than the state. We get back $1.25 from the feds for every dollar that we send to Washington. So when cuts get made to Medicaid, and the reason for that is simply because we have high rates of poverty, and a lot of these programs are tied to income. So we have more people on Medicaid because we have more people who qualify for Medicaid because they have very low incomes. We have more people on SNAP because we have more people who qualify for food assistance because they have very low incomes. When those programs get cut, it's not only going to hurt people who depend on those programs for food on the table and access to health care that they couldn't afford without it, but it's also going to have an economic spillover effect in Louisiana because the dollars that people get for SNAP get spent in grocery stores and convenience stores and farmers markets and small and medium and large-sized businesses all over Louisiana. The money that gets spent through Medicaid goes to private doctors and hospitals and nursing homes and outpatient clinics and pharmacies. So it is going to be an economic effect, and it's going to make it, again, harder for the legislature to balance the budget. So I don't have perfect vision of the future, but I just wanted to kind of close by saying, if you remember what the politics of the budget were like in 2009, 10, 11, and the difficulties that posed for the state. If you know anybody in higher education, for example, you know that a lot of college campuses haven't really recovered yet from the cuts that were made back then. Teachers fell behind in salary compared to their southern peers during the Great Recession. During that time, they still haven't caught up. It's 15 years later. They still haven't caught up. They make $5,000 less than their southern partners, more than $10,000, Cynthia would know, less than their national peers. So, yeah, I'll just leave you with, I think we're going into some tough budget times, and we're going to do our best to keep educating the public, reaching out to policymakers. I think, I really wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe that we can build a stronger economy by investing in families and making sure everybody has an equal shot at the American dream and building that here in Louisiana. But those things cost money, and we're going to in for some troubling times. So with that, I'll leave it to anybody who has any questions.
Okay. Yes, sir.
You mentioned right now, I saw in the introduction, you mentioned some of the things that the state is going to be liable for, like the diversion down on the coast and saving the coast. Right now, we're at the hot for what, $500 million? And they stopped the project. How dangerous is that right now, the state having to pay that money?
So the question, I think, was about the Barataria settlement, and so I'm not the expert on exactly what the clawback provisions are. My understanding, and there are people we work with who know this much better than we do, but that the project is, there's been an enormous amount of planning for this, but that the project is going to be halted, and again, I think the answer is I don't know exactly how and when that money would need to be paid back. I imagine it wouldn't be an immediate problem for the state, but one that would get negotiated over time. But that certainly is a huge another financial risk to the state. I know somebody else must have questions. The question was about the March ballots.
Media campaign, information campaign, whatever.
Our intent is certainly to educate voters. We don't have the resources that others do. So part of the way we're going to do it is through events like this, and we'll do webinars. And if we can get some resources, we might do some paid public education on this, but and I know that there are, I can't speak for any other organizations, but I know that there is some concern with, among some of our partners and allies about the other amendments. I have not focused much on the specialty courts or the juvenile justice components, but I know that there's some concern about that. The answer is I don't know what kind of paid media campaign, but I suspect, as we get closer to March 29th, and, we'll certainly be putting out research and analysis, and I expect that a lot of our partners will do the same. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. What two specific impacts, one positive and one negative, do you think the recently enacted tariffs will have on our Louisiana budget?
The question was about tariffs and the Louisiana budget and a positive or a negative impact.
One positive, one negative.
I suspect, and I'm not an economist, though I play one at the podium sometimes, I suspect a positive one would be the impact on energy production and domestic energy production in particular. Louisiana is obviously an oil and gas state, And if we're going to put tariffs and make imports from Canada in particular more expensive, that would seem to benefit producers in Louisiana. So I think that would be a clear positive effect. I think a negative effect would be on the ports. Louisiana is at the mouth of the Mississippi River. We have some of the largest ports in the country between here and New Orleans, and we export a lot of stuff. So if there are tariffs, that means there's probably going to be less, and foreign countries impose retaliatory tariffs. There's going to be less stuff coming in and less stuff coming out, and I suspect that'll have an effect on the ports.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
The phone calls to private schools like Catholic and St. Joseph or Newman and Country Day in New Orleans, Country Day and Newman are about $22,000 per child, and the ones in Baton Rouge are around $13,000. How much will the voucher support for someone to try to get their children into those schools?
The question was, what will the cost of the vouchers be compared to the tuition at some of the elite private schools? I don't have an exact answer. It certainly wouldn't cover the cost of tuition. So if you're spending $30,000 to send your child to Episcopal, the state's not going to send you $30,000. It would be well below that, and I think it would be comparable to about what the state spends on a per pupil basis. So certainly it wouldn't. But the question is, if you're already spending that money and you made that choice as a family, which is a choice that you should always have, then should the taxpayers be underwriting that, even if it's just a portion of that tuition? One thing we've seen in other states with similar programs, Louisiana is not the first state with education savings accounts, is that it has actually driven up tuition at private schools because they figured out that parents were getting these vouchers. So again, it's been very good for private schools because they've been able to raise tuition and not have to push that off on the parents. So, yes, sir.
North Carolina did something very powerful 50 years ago or more in establishing a research triangle that produces everything from pharmaceuticals to software. So they have a tax stream. Louisiana, on the other hand, has attracted industries that result in more tax exemptions than taxes paid. And we set ourselves up for a future where we're rich in resources but poor in quality of life.
The question, well, the statement was about North Carolina and the research triangle and comparing that to Louisiana, where we have provided generous tax incentive for manufacturing corporations. Well, I think certainly you can look at the difference between the two states. Manufacturing has been important. The oil and gas industry has been very important to this state for generations. It's been an absolute backbone of our state for a long time. I think one of the things that I was disappointed that, let me just say, like, one of the good things that the special session on taxes did, especially on the corporate side, it eliminated some tax breaks that have been on the books for a long time. So if you look at that corporate tax bill, it actually did, it lowered the corporate tax rate, but the amount of revenue that we're going to expect it to take in corporate taxes is actually going to go up slightly in a couple of years, because we paid for that rate reduction by eliminating some tax exemptions and some tax breaks that the state's own audits have shown for years were not producing the return on investments that they were supposed to. So I'm not going to say that everything the legislature did was bad, but we still have some very generous tax breaks on the books. And the biggest of those, of course, is the industrial tax exemption program. I'm glad that the governor didn't eliminate the reforms that happened during the past 8 years, but he certainly did streamline it, and he took away the jobs requirement, which I thought was frankly a big mistake, because now we're essentially telling companies that if you make an investment in your factory that costs jobs, you're literally buying a machine, and that machine is going to do the work of 10 or 50 or 100 workers, we're going to give you a tax incentive to do that. And I think that's certainly, businesses are entitled to be as productive and efficient as they can be, but I don't know if we should be incentivizing that with a property tax break. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, a follow-up on that. I was going through some tax buster memorabilia recently, and in 1996, corporate welfare cost Louisiana $233 million. So meanwhile, 29 years later, how much is it costing us today?
The question was about corporate welfare, and that's kind of a broad question, and I don't really know how you would define that. So, and I don't have a definitive answer. And frankly, I think welfare gets a bad word. I think it's, I don't think we should stigmatize that word.
Well, substitute taxes, corporate tax exemption cost Louisiana $233 million in 96. How much today? Guesstimate.
I don't want to provide a guess. I would rather have actual numbers, but certainly we have very generous corporate tax incentives on the books in Louisiana, and again, I think the corporate, I was one of the few people who defended the corporate franchise tax that got eliminated, and I kind of knew I was going to lose that argument, but that's one of those taxes I thought was not a terrible tax. It was mostly paid by very large, very profitable multinational corporations. And so when you cut that tax, you're really mostly helping the shareholders of those companies that don't live in Louisiana. That argument fell on deaf ears. The legislature decided that they wanted that it was a deterrent to companies investing in Louisiana, and we'll find out. But certainly I think we can do a lot to make our system more fair. Yes, sir.
When Governor Lamb presented this plan, he said that it, quote, eliminated, unquote, the lowest tax bracket, and in doing so, it provided the, quote, largest slice, unquote, of the tax cut to the lowest income of Louisiana's population. Do you feel that statement was misleading, and if so, do you feel it was intentionally misleading?
I can't. The question was about the distributional effect of the tax changes, if I'm paraphrasing correctly, and whether the governor was intentionally misleading. I cannot speak to the governor's intentions because I don't live in his mind. I will tell you that the distributional analysis I've seen, and this was, we work closely with an organization called ITEP, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and what they do is, they have a sophisticated economic model that they built that looks at the distributional impact of tax changes. And so when you look at the tax changes, you need to look at them in totality because, what are you going to be paying less in income tax and what are you going to be paying more in sales tax? And so what they found is that the changes, when combined, most people are getting a net tax cut. So we're going to have less revenue coming into state government. The only group with a net tax increase is actually those in the bottom 20%. It's negligible. According to ITEP's numbers, that they would get a net tax increase of about $11. And that's because a lot of folks in the very bottom brackets already don't pay income tax. Now, they are raising the standard deduction, and so they did protect, and I give the governor credit for trying to protect the lowest income taxpayers. But when you have a very low income, you're also spending a lot of your money on sales tax. So, and I can show you the chart, but essentially, every group got a net tax cut except for the very bottom, who essentially broke even. And keep in mind that it's going to be different for every single taxpayer because we all have different spending patterns. And how you spend your disposable income is different than how I spend mine. We do know that those at the very top of the income ladder, of course, they make more money, so they pay more in taxes, and they're going to benefit the most from these tax changes. So if you are lucky enough to be in the top 1% of income earners in Louisiana, which means your take-home income after taxes is about $1.9 million. That puts you in the top 1%. Then your overall tax cut is going to be something on the order of $16,000. Yes, sir.
I don't know if you've done an assessment of the gaming industry, growing gaming industry, but is the growth in gaming, is this good for Louisiana? Is this negligible? Is it bad?
The question was about the growth in the gaming industry, and I think you have to look at that from a couple of different vantage points. And so we haven't done a lot of work specifically on gaming. I moved here from Las Vegas, so I've seen the effect of the gaming industry. I know that it can be very destructive to people who can't, who develop a habit. So there are big societal costs that come with gambling. Certainly in Louisiana, I think from a revenue standpoint, it was pretty steady for a long time. I don't think it was growing or shrinking, but then we added sports betting to the mix and online sports betting, and my impression is that has been more, bringing in more revenue and has been more popular than expected. There was a bill that came up that was filed for the special session that would have essentially doubled the tax on sports betting. That bill didn't go anywhere. The industry killed that pretty quickly. It's going to be interesting to see, but I think, and of course the industry, especially the brick and mortar casinos, create a lot of jobs. And so my sense is, I think there's costs and there's consequences. I think it is interesting that, we had a state for many years where the oil and gas industry paid a lion's share of the taxes, kind of the way gambling does in Nevada. In 1982, I think, Jay Darden's famous chart, 42% of the state general fund revenue came from oil and gas, severance and royalties. Today, that is around 4% of the general fund comes from oil and gas, and we actually get more money in the general fund from gambling than we do from oil and gas. And so our economy's changed a lot since 1982, and I think, we'll have to see. Yes, sir.
You fundamentally mentioned the triangle in the Carolinas, but isn't really the big difference education? A few years ago, I had someone at that podium, we should have a resolution at LSU that had one out-of-state to a picture with 4 more Louisianians, and today it's 1 out-of-state to 2. And 1/3 of LSU is now out-of-state to students that maybe didn't get into their state college, Texas A&M, Georgia. It is the real fundamental education, the difference in Louisiana and the Carolinas.
The question was about the difference in education between Louisiana and the Carolinas. Absolutely, I fundamentally believe that the better job we can do of educating our students and making sure that education is affordable and available to everybody. And when I say education, I don't just mean the flagship university. I mean everything from early childhood education, K through 12 schools, whether it's traditional public schools and charter schools. I don't want to get into that. Community and technical college education. I think it's pretty clear that if you're going to have a successful economic existence in this state, you have to have some credential beyond a high school degree, and we need to make sure that is accessible and affordable and of a high quality and trains people for the jobs that are actually out there. And the better we can do with that over a long sustained period of time. I mean, it's hard work. And if you're a politician, the payoff may not come before the next election. It may be a generation after you're out of office, but ultimately I believe those kind of investments are the ones that are going to pay off and create the kind of state that we all want to live in, and create the kind of economy where we don't have to think about, what incentives and what giveaways we're going to give to lure the next company. Thank you so much.
Of course.